And now, a passage from the Old China Trade, Chapter 2, Old Canton. At the close of the 18th century, Canton was the one Chinese port open to the Western world. It had been first visited by the Portuguese in 1516. 108 years later came the Dutch, and in 1637 the English. An important trade had been established, but from the day on which the red-haired barbarians had first arrived, and by their tremendously loud guns shook the place far and near, the Chinese had looked upon the newcomers with suspicion. Secure in their arrogant conviction that in China alone could be found any true civilization, the haughty mandarins tolerated the foreigners with studied indifference. They were permitted to trade as the princes of neighboring states were permitted to pay tribute. It was a privilege for which the nations of the Western Ocean should ever be thankful to the august clemency of the Son of Heaven. Again and again had the Europeans attempted to break through this wall of pride and ignorance. It was absolutely impossible. Nothing could shake the celestial confidence in China as the one great nation under the blue canopy of heaven, and in the Emperor as the lawgiver of all the world. The embassies which Portugal and Holland had dispatched to Peking could make no dent upon this feeling of self-sufficiency. The protestations of friendship were taken as a matter of course, their presence condescendingly accepted as evidence of true humility, and their requests for further trading privileges indifferently waved aside. On each occasion the foreign embassies returned to Canton with empty hands. Every imperial edict concerning the foreign devils heaped scorn upon their heads. As the dispositions of these said foreigners are depraved by the education and customs of countries beyond the bounds of civilization, read one of them, they are incapable of following right reason, their characters are formed, their perverse obstinacy is untamable, and they are dead to the influence of our renovating laws and manners. Yet so valuable were the teas and silks of Canton that the Europeans tamely submitted to every affront offered them by the mandarins. In other parts of the East, they had dispossessed the native rulers. England controlled the dying East Indies of the Moguls, and the Dutch had made themselves lords of the East Indies. But in Canton they traded on sufferance and clung tenaciously to the few privileges which had been granted them. The Americans quickly enrolled themselves in the submissive foreign settlement outside the city walls, and perhaps their experiences may best present a picture of actual conditions at Canton. Samuel Shaw has left us a description of the port as he found it in 1784, and later traders have somewhat added to it. It was several decades before any material change occurred. No breach was made in the impenetrable wall which China had set up against foreign encroachments until, goaded beyond endurance, the English fell back upon force and proved that in this respect at least the Chinese had to admit Western superiority. The American vessels approached Canton from the south, as had the Empress of China, making their way up the China coast in the fall. At Macau, as we have seen, they were obliged to get a chop, or official permit, to enter Chinese territory, and also to take on Chinese pilots. Then again, all ships were examined at the mouth of the Pearl River, where the forbidding Bogue forts afforded the Chinese a somewhat questionable protection against invasion, since their guns, firmly anchored in stone sockets, could shoot in only one direction. If all still went well, the mandarins thereupon permitted them to proceed to the anchorage at Whampoa, some 12 miles below Canton itself. Here in the winter months, when the teas and silks were in the market, might be found the foreign fleet. It was always an imposing sight. Traveler after traveler bears witness to the sudden thrill he felt upon rounding a narrow bend in the river, and finding anchored in the reaches a line of great ships, which sometimes stretched for 3 miles. Even in 1784 this fleet totaled 45 vessels, and as the trade grew and more American ships came every season to take up their anchorage at the head of the line, the number rose to well over 100. When David Abel, one of the first 2 American missionaries to China, arrived in Canton in 1829 and found the East India Company's fleet at Whampoa, he wrote enthusiastically that it represented an array of naval magnificence unequaled in any other port. This was but a first introduction to the exotic charms of Canton. When the fast boats which plied between Whampoa and Canton were taken upriver, there was spread out before the eyes of visitors such a scene as their imaginations could never have painted. The river was crowded with Chinese shipping, strange craft of every possible description. Great ungainly salt junks and 600-ton vessels for the Java trade lined the banks or made their way slowly downstream, their high sterns fantastically decorated, and their sharp prows painted with huge eyes to spy out the devils of the sea. River junks were manned by gangs of naked coolies who treaded paddle wheels or, like the Christian slaves of Roman galleys, pulled on long sweeps. Mandarin boats flying white and vermilion flags with red sashes tied about the muzzles of their cannons patrolled the shores. Even more strange and foreign to the eyes of travelers from the other side of the world were the gaily decorated flower boats where the mandarins dallied with Chinese ladies of pleasure. At night, when the din of warning gongs had subsided and the flares of burning joss paper had died down, these craft became mysterious and disturbing. Weird strains of oriental music floated out over the still river. Nearer the city, the press of boats was even thicker. In and out among the larger vessels sped tiny sampans which served not only as carrier boats and loaded and unloaded the cargoes of the sea-going junks, but housed the great floating population of the Chinese city. They were mysteriously abundant. Everywhere they congregate in vast numbers. Like a stream they advance and retire unceasingly. Thousands were moored along the river banks in addition to those plying their trade, and on each of them an entire family made its home. On the stern of every sampan burned a tiny fire, over which a woman might be cooking the evening meal. The decks were cluttered with pots and pans and all manner of household utensils, while slung over the sides were wicker baskets of hens and ducks. Children, 3 and 4 perhaps to each sampan, played about unconcernedly with wooden buoys tied to their backs. This was the scene which the first American visitors to Canton came upon as they were taken up the river in 1784. Even today it has changed little except for the addition of river steamers and motor launches. Thousands of Chinese still live on the river, as did their ancestors. Their tiny sampans are still mysteriously abundant. When the fast boats passed the 2 Chinese forts known as Dutch Folly and French Folly and came opposite Jackass Point, the travelers at last could see the foreign factories, the goal of the long voyage from the west. Soon the American flag was to be added to those which waved so proudly from the shore, but the trading posts first established were those of England, France, Holland, Denmark, Sweden, Spain, and Austria. They were grouped together in a long line some 300 feet back from the river, 2 and 3 stories high, with sloping roofs and neatly whitewashed walls. We are told that they made a very pretty appearance. The godowns where chests of tea and bales of silk were stored took up the first floors, living quarters were on the second and third. Covered galleries ran through the open courtyards which separated the hongs. The most imposing of the buildings was that of the East India Company, the factory that ensures tranquility, as it was rather optimistically called by the Chinese. It had a wide veranda supported by pilasters in princely grandeur. In front of the factories was an open square which at the time of Shaw's visit was enclosed by a rail fence, giving the Europeans the privilege of its exclusive use. But in 1822, when the foreign hongs burned down and were replaced by new buildings of brick and granite, in a neat style but with slight pretensions to architecture, this space was made a free thoroughfare. The Chinese then thronged through it at all hours, either to watch with insatiable curiosity the strange antics of the barbarians, or to carry on the various trades of a Chinese market. It was crowded with itinerant barbers, tailors, cobblers, jugglers, and storytellers. Peddlers hawked their wares, pickled olives, paper umbrellas, lychee nuts, or pastry, and filthy beggars cried for alms outside the foreigners' windows. Sometimes the Chinese police would clear the square by driving off peddlers and loafers with their long whips. More often it would remain so densely packed that Americans and Europeans could hardly elbow their way through the crowd. Near the factories were some few streets which were also open to the foreigners. 13 Factory Street ran behind the hongs, and the square was bounded by Hog Lane and Old China Street. Here, innumerable Chinese shops offered a wide variety of native wares. Ivory, silks, silver, and gold might be sold or exchanged, but also one could purchase bird cages, fireworks, insects, medical herbs, cats, and dogs. There were many shops for the benefit of foreign seamen. Ostensibly their wares were curious and souvenirs, and they offered tea and refreshments to draw their customers. Actually, Samshu, a fiery local wine, was the great attraction which thronged Hog Lane with sailors of all nationalities whenever ships were in port. All in all, the plot of ground to which foreigners were restricted was not more than a quarter-mile square. Here they had to remain during the winter months, while cargoes were being unloaded in exchange for teas and silks. In the summer, they had to return to Macau. All foreign trade in Canton was strictly regulated. No Chinese was allowed to do any real business with the visitors except the members of the Kohong, a body of Chinese merchants who paid for the privileged monopoly of foreign trade. The first thing which the captain or supercargo of every newly arrived vessel had to do was to secure one of these men to act as his ship's security merchant, responsible to the Chinese authorities not only for vessel and cargo, but for its crew and their good behavior. In no other way could any business be transacted. It was the hung merchant who paid all duties to the government, and who had to submit to every exaction of the officials, who openly lined their purses with arbitrary levies upon the foreign commerce. Should the Hapo, as the chief customs officer was known, or the provincial governor demand that the customs returns show a greater revenue, there was no recourse for the hung merchant but to produce it. He passed the burden of these demands on to the foreign traders, but the process was indirect and highly simplified. They merely paid a higher price for their tea, and knew that the difference between market cost and what the hung merchants charged them was a thinly disguised bribe to officialdom for the privilege of trade. The only direct duty levied on the shipping under this system was the measurement charge, which every vessel had to pay before its cargo could be unloaded. The Hapo performed the task of determining the amount to be contributed to the imperial treasury, and his path had to be smoothed by small bribes in the form of European curios. Clocks, watches, musical snuff-boxes, and smellum water were the conventional gifts. Upon the occasion of the arrival of the Empress of China, ignorance of this custom had left Shaw without any of these articles, but he appears to have met the situation successfully, for after the ship had been measured, the Hapo sent aboard, as a present to the newcomers, 2 bowls, 8 bags of flour, and 7 jars of country wine. While the foreigners had to rely upon their Kohong for all trade, another such organization had been formed to handle their ships, supplies, and the needs of their factories ashore. Its members were known as compradors, and every vessel had to have one if it expected to take on any provisions. All other business which involved contact with the Chinese had to be performed through still a third group of specially privileged men. They supplied the sampans to load and unload the ships, and as they acted generally as interpreters, for none of the foreigners during this early period had the slightest knowledge of Chinese, they were known as linguists. It was a ludicrous misnomer. None of them really spoke any foreign language, and the sole medium of communication between the Chinese and their visitors was that queer jargon known as Pidgin English. On the whole, this unique system of trade worked well. Eventually it broke down, but in 1784 the Americans accepted it gladly. They put themselves entirely in the hands of the Chinese, and from the time of Shaw's first contact with the Kohong until the end of the period with which we are concerned, which also marked the end of the Kohong, there were few complaints on the part of American merchants. As soon as he had experienced its workings, Shaw wrote that the trade at Canton appears to be as little embarrassed and is, perhaps, as simple as any in the known world. His testimony was corroborated by almost all his successors. To take but 2 examples, in 1830 an American resident of long-standing W. Wood wrote that the ease and expedition with which business is conducted in China renders mercantile transactions more agreeable than in any other part of the world. 4 years later, John Robert Morrison declared in his Commercial Guide to Canton that there was no port where trade could be carried on with such facility and regularity. This does not mean that commerce was not subjected to many petty annoyances, and that the greed and corruption of the Chinese officials did not bring many abuses in their train. But as business as a whole was entirely carried on through the Hong merchants, the chief responsibility was theirs, and they lived up to their obligations. Again, we have Shaw's testimony, valuable not merely because he was the first American to do business in Canton, but because his opinions were never seriously disputed. The merchants of the Kohong, he wrote, are as responsible a set of men as are commonly found in other parts of the world. They are intelligent, exact accountants, punctual to their engagements, and, though none the worse for being well looked after, value themselves much upon maintaining a fair character. The concurrent testimony of all Europeans justifies this remark. In later years, American opinion of the Kohong was just as favorable. As a body of merchants, we found them honorable and reliable in all their dealings, faithful to their contracts and large-minded, wrote William C. Hunter, who first sailed for China in 1824. And just 60 years after Shaw had first paid them his respects, Robert B. Forbes, one of the most prominent Americans in the China trade, stated his absolute agreement with his predecessor's conclusions. It was in fact from this traditional integrity of the Hong merchants that the Chinese gained the reputation for unusual honesty, but early visitors to Canton never carried their encomiums this far. From the days of the visit of an English voyager who found that the ducks he bought by weight had been stuffed with pebbles, and that sad occasion when an American trader discovered that the colors of some birds he had bought for their gay plumage washed off in the rain, the knavery of the Chinese shopkeepers had become proverbial. No Indians we had ever visited during the voyage was more complete in the art of thieving than the Chinese of the lower order. They appeared to me to be the greatest villains in the universe, was the outspoken opinion of one American in 1792. The smaller dealers were in fact generally looked upon as almost universal rogues, and it is only too apparent that Chinese honesty is subject to the same limitations as that of any other people. Generalizations based upon the integrity of the Hong merchants, who necessarily found honesty not only the best policy, but one from which they could not deviate and remain members of the Kohong, created a myth no truer during the period of the old China trade than it is today. Insofar as the social life of the foreigners at Canton was concerned, they were subject to as strict regulations as their commerce. The hauteur and condescension which characterized China's attitude toward the West found its expression in the rules which governed all the visitors' comings and goings. The barbarians are like beasts, read a Chinese maxim, and not to be ruled on the same principles as citizens. Were any one to attempt controlling them by the great maxims of reason, it would tend to nothing but confusion. The ancient kings well understood this, and accordingly ruled barbarians by misrule. Therefore, to rule barbarians by misrule is the true and best way of ruling them. And of course, in the eyes of the Chinese, all Westerners, whether English, Dutch, French, or Americans, were barbarians. The foreign residents accordingly had no rights outside the narrow confines of their settlement. They could not enter Canton itself or wander about the countryside. On only 4 days of each moon were they permitted to make excursions accompanied by one of the linguists to the Fatih flower gardens on the opposite bank of the river, or to the nearby Honam Joss House, and then read the 5th of the 8 regulations governing their conduct. They could not go in droves of more than 10 at a time, and must return to the factories as soon as they were refreshed. They could not row on the river themselves, nor could their ships loiter about or rove about the bays at pleasure. And finally, neither women, guns, spears, nor arms of any kind can be brought to the factories, declared one order which neatly grouped arms and females as elements equally likely to disturb the tranquillity of the celestial empire. Life was cabined, cribbed, confined to an impossible degree. Samuel Shaw considered the situation in which the Europeans found themselves anything but enviable, and wrote emphatically that considering the length of time they reside in the country, the restrictions to which they must submit, the great distance they are at from their connections, the want of society and of almost any amusement, it must be allowed that they dearly earn their money. Some of his successors who remained longer in Canton eventually discovered that the comforts and luxury of life in China to some degree made up for its restrictions, but at best it was tedious and monotonous except for the busy period when the teas were actually in the market. It is true that William C. Hunter could in later life recall somewhat sentimentally that no one left Canton without regret because of the novelty of the life, the social good feeling, and the facility of all dealings with the Chinese, but there is a somewhat more realistic touch in the memoirs of one of his contemporaries who speaks of his utter dreariness in pacing up and down in the square before the factories. In time, the original regulations were slightly relaxed. The foreigners organized boating clubs and held regattas on the river. They made occasional excursions in the countryside, but the hostility of the Cantonese always made such gestures towards freedom extremely hazardous. The rule by which foreign devil females were so strictly excluded was one which remained in force throughout the entire period of the old China trade. Great was the excitement some 45 years after Shaw's visit, when first an Englishman and then an American dared to make the experiment of bringing his family to the foreign settlement. In the case of the Englishman, the president of the Select Committee of the East India Company, who combined with this offense the heinous crime of riding in a sedan chair. The result was almost open hostilities. The Chinese threatened, the English brought up guards from their ships to defend themselves, and peace and order were restored only by the ladies' hurried retreat to Macau. Foreigners clandestinely taking foreign females to dwell in the factories at Canton, their ascending to sit in shoulder chariots, sedan chairs, declared an emphatic reaffirmation of the old regulation hurriedly issued by the Chinese officials, must both be interdicted. Nor was the American female invasion of Canton any more successful. William H. Lowe, a partner in the well-known Canton House of Russell and Company, had to send his family back to Macau almost as soon as they had arrived. The Chinese authorities were prepared to stop all trade with his firm, and no weapon to enforce their regulations could be more effective. One member of this party was Lowe's 20-year-old niece, whose brief visit naturally created a sensation among the American residents. Unfortunately, the delightful diary she kept of her travels in the East has survived in only fragmentary form as far as this episode is concerned, but it is apparent in such remarks as, "You have no idea how elegantly these bachelors live here. I don't wonder they like it." That Canton, to her, was a novel and exciting experience. "Good-for-nothing creatures that they are," was her sole comment on the Chinese, but this was inspired by the cruel order that trade would be stopped if one Lowe did not immediately remove his family to Macau.